Hello survivors, Rurikon here coming at you with another video, and today I'm bringing you my review of the highly anticipated and highly controversial The Last of Us Part 2. This title was sent to me by PlayStation Portugal so I could give it a look and tell you guys my opinions on it.
Come on, this way.
So for the newcomers, what is the Last of Us franchise all about? In its essence, it is a narrative-driven zombie survival game that has you scavenging resources, crafting improvised tools and traps, as well as upgrading weapons as you engage in combat with both infected and other humans throughout a post-apocalyptic American landscape. What truly sets it apart from other survival games is the focus on the narrative and the engaging gameplay, both of which are very solid and polished. As I'm sure you're aware if you've been around my channel for a while, I rarely ever pay any attention to post-apocalyptic zombie survival games. I usually don't find them very appealing, and I feel the concept has been driven into the ground and then some to exploit the mass appeal of the genre. And you can argue, oh, but these aren't zombies, they're infected, it's totally different, but personally I don't really subscribe to that viewpoint. The infected are, from a gameplay perspective, zombies, and that's not to take away from the originality of their concept with the cordyceps fungus, which is a phenomena that actually happens in real life between the fungi with the same name and different types of insects, which is pretty cool. But essentially the reason why I decided to check out the first Last of Us game was because it was developed by Naughty Dog, the same studio behind Uncharted, which is a series I greatly enjoyed, so I knew I could count on the title being a polished experience, you know, as opposed to the other millions of zombie cash grab titles out there. And overall, I greatly enjoyed the first Last of Us game. There's even a full playthrough on the channel because back in the day I still did those on a regular basis. I thought the character development of Joel and Ellie was really well done, the story was fantastic, and the gameplay was solid. So naturally I wanted to play the sequel. The Last of Us Part 2 is a direct sequel to the original, so naturally playing the first game will give you much more context of the story behind the characters and greatly increase the impact of certain story beats. So for all the people out there that usually ask, do I need to play the first game to understand the story? The answer is no. You don't need to do it since the plot is explained to you and certain key events from the first game are shown to the player to ensure you understand the context behind what's happening story-wise. However, if you are a newcomer to the franchise, I would still greatly advise you to play the first game before starting The Last of Us Part 2. You don't need to do it, but if you are invested in the characters, your experience will be much richer. But anyway, let's get this show on the road.
Don't make a fucking sound. Hands up.
Naughty Dog games tend to have some of the best visuals in the business, and The Last of Us Part 2 is no exception. The level of detail here, both in terms of characters and levels, is quite impressive, which makes the whole experience incredibly immersive. The variety of locations you visit is also quite nice and allows them to explore a wide palette of colors, which provides a much welcome contrast between the grittiness of exploring infested nests full of spores in underground locations where the only source of light is your trusty flashlight, and being out in the post-apocalyptic cityscape that's been taken over by nature. The varying weather during different sections of the game also provides a lot of visual variety, from scavenging in towns covered in snow, beach areas bathed in sunlight, to roaring storms, a lot of which I unfortunately won't be allowed to show in this review because of embargo restrictions, but trust me, there's a lot to see and all of it looks very impressive. In terms of animations, once again, Naughty Dog delivers everything from character movements, the seamless transitions into in-game cutscenes and back into gameplay, the firing of weapons, visceral melee attacks, and executions. Everything is extremely well polished. During cutscenes, the character expressions are also very realistic, which greatly adds to the experience. From a technical standpoint, I can't give you the exact specs in terms of resolution and frame rate since I don't have the same tools as Digital Foundry, but on my PlayStation 4 Pro, the game is definitely running higher than 1080p. I believe most likely we're looking at native 2K with their checkerboard 4K upscaling and 30 FPS. The FPS was solid throughout the whole game and I never experienced any noticeable frame drops. The Last of Us Part 2 also features a wide variety of visual accessibility options which can be heavily customized, from magnifying certain screen areas to increasing HUD size, colorblind options, and high contrast display. I don't think I've ever seen this many accessibility options in a game before. I do have a couple of minor complaints though before we wrap up this section. Chief among them is a feature I really don't like in video games, being basically forced on you for the whole experience. And that feature is film grain. I'm not a fan of film grain and it always bothers me, but usually most games have the common courtesy to allow us to turn it off. But as of the recording of this video, that option is not available and I don't see it mentioned anywhere in the next couple of patches for the game. I get it that several developers believe it gives games a cinematic aesthetic, but personally, I can't stand it. And as a content creator, all it does is it makes recordings look terrible due to video compression, which also means most of the footage for The Last of Us Part 2 that you watch on YouTube actually is going to look a lot worse than when you play the game itself. Beyond that, I've encountered a couple of glitches throughout my playthrough which I hadn't experienced before in Naughty Dog games, such as Ellie's flashlight not loading in, leaving you without a source of light. A waterfall shader broke at one point, making the water white, yellow, and red, and a boss encounter didn't load properly so the boss wasn't there, and then the level itself broke and I fell through the world. All of these are quickly solved by restarting the game, but it was still surprising for me to see them in a Naughty Dog title. The Last of Us Part 2's audio is outstanding, and I'm saying this as someone who played through the whole thing on a standard stereo headset. Whenever you hear infected or gunfire or any kind of positional audio, it's fairly easy to identify where that noise is coming from. The audio cues for when you are about to get spotted are also very nice. The gunfire sounds are good and varied depending on the weapon being fired, which means you can also identify the type of weapon that is being shot at you. The hits sound good and impactful, regardless if you're getting hit by a gun or a melee swing, which are also made all the better by the outstanding animation work we mentioned in the previous section. The voice acting is top-notch, the voice actors did a really good job delivering their lines, which makes the characters feel more authentic, and there's also a variety of audio options, so if you have a better audio setup, the game will take full advantage of that. Furthermore, they've included several accessibility options, including even some text-to-speech options for visually impaired gamers and audio cues for several in-game actions. Technically speaking, both in terms of visuals and audio, the game does not disappoint, and it delivers a very impressive and immersive experience.
We could have killed you. Maybe you should have.
This is hands down the hardest section of this review, in large part because of the embargo restrictions on what we're allowed to discuss. So if at any point anything I say sounds too vague, it probably just means I can't get into any more detail than that. So let me start this by saying, if the first Last of Us is a story about how far we're willing to go to protect the ones we love, then this game is a story about how far we're willing to go to get back at the ones who wronged us. It is a story about the cycle of revenge, its consequences, and raw, unmitigated violence. One could almost say the Infested take a bit of a backseat from a story perspective. They just happen to be in the world, and sometimes they get in your way, but there are no narrative threads that explore the cordyceps fungus or any other potential solutions to the plague. The story focuses exclusively on the survivors. The story starts off by showing us a day in Ellie's life, as she is settling on her role as a productive member in a community of survivors. They introduce us to a couple of her friends and show us what life is like for the average survivor 5 years after the events of the first game. During this introductory sequence, certain events play out which set Ellie and her friends on a path of vengeance, and from this moment onward the narrative tone shifts away from the struggles of surviving in a world full of Infested in favor of good old-fashioned vendetta. And as you fight your way through Infested and other factions of survivors, the story starts focusing on revenge as an unending cycle. When does it end? How much pain and suffering are you allowed to inflict on someone in your pursuit of justice? How big does your pound of flesh need to be? There are other themes throughout the story, such as the empathy for the suffering of others, romance, familial obligation, but the main driving factor is still revenge and how far characters are willing to go to inflict pain and misery on one another. Now, my personal opinion on the story is somewhat conflicting. There are parts of it that definitely resonated with me. I like a good revenge story, and I think it is a good motivator, but at the same time, I felt like certain characters simply didn't make a lot of sense. For instance, there is a character who performs an extremely heinous act of violence, like a really sick, messed up thing, which is shown to the player in great detail. Later in the story, the game then goes to great lengths trying to show the player this character is actually incredibly nice, reliable, caring, and capable of great empathy. Personally, I just wasn't convinced of this character arc. It didn't feel right, and I could point out several other actions about this character I found inconsistent throughout the story beyond what I just mentioned. Overall, I greatly enjoyed about 60% of the story. The rest just didn't really make that much sense to me. It took me about 26 hours or so to beat the game. I didn't rush through it, I took my time, so I imagine it can be done faster if you beeline objectives and don't scavenge or explore as much. Now, over the last couple of weeks, there's been a lot of discussion in the gaming community about this game pushing a progressive agenda on the players, and my thoughts on that are very simple. Whenever I play a game, I want to experience the developer's vision. I never want to see the artists limit themselves over what society may or may not think about their game. Having said that, the story sections that bothered me in The Last of Us Part 2 had nothing to do with forced inclusivity or lack thereof. What bothered me was the development of certain characters, and in some ways, this even includes Ellie. Before I started writing this script, I put up a post in the community section of my YouTube channel requesting people to ask me anything they'd like to see me address about the game, and two questions that came up quite often were, does The Last of Us 2 respect the story of the original Last of Us, and which of the stories did I enjoy more? Now, the first question is hard to answer. I mean, it's not my story. The only person entitled to answer that question would be Neil Druckmann and his team of writers. I feel like in certain sections, Ellie acts out of character, but there are story events that can somewhat justify her actions, even if I personally still don't buy it. But there is another character from the first game that goes off the rails in a way I can't really understand. In regards to which story I liked most, it was definitely the original. I'll probably end up doing a spoiler discussion at some point after the game's been out for a few days to provide more context into all of this, but for now, this is all you're getting. And keep in mind, at the end of the day, this is just one man's opinion, so make sure to check out what other reviewers have to say about it.
Got you, asshole!
So now let's talk about the gameplay, and if you played the original, there really isn't that much to add here. The Last of Us Part 2 plays like a third-person shooter. The gameplay structure focuses on three main elements: scavenging, combat, and puzzle solving. As with most survival games, you'll need to scavenge for resources while you navigate the levels. Resources are always limited, so you'll have to make choices as to what items you'll craft from them. For instance, you can use alcohol and rags to create med kits to patch yourself up, or you can use them to craft a Molotov cocktail to make your enemies extra crispy. There's a progression system for both your character and your weapons. When you scavenge, you'll find scrap, which can be used to upgrade those weapons for better handling, more damage, scopes, etc. You'll also find supplement pills that can be used to acquire new passive skills for your character, like bigger health pool, better aiming, better hearing, etc. Throughout your journeys, you'll also find rare books that grant you access to more specialized skill trees that can improve your character in different ways, like crafting, shooting, stealth kills, etc. Personally, I always found the gunplay in The Last of Us to be intentionally harder than other third-person shooters like Uncharted, for instance. Part of that is because at the start, your character doesn't have any of the passive upgrades that improve the weapon handling. And the other part is because ammo is very limited, so you need to make every shot count. However, as you play the game and learn its systems, you'll begin to improve by stealth killing as many enemies as possible before engaging in open confrontation, using bricks and bottles to stun enemies for easy killing blows, and using other craftable tools to thin their numbers before resorting to firearms. Very much like its predecessor, this is not the type of game you can go in guns blazing. You will have to play smart. The biggest difference I noticed in The Last of Us Part 2 in terms of gameplay was definitely the size of the levels. I actually found myself lost a couple of times because I wanted to scavenge as much as possible, to play around with the crafting system and upgrade my guns. But don't be worried about getting stuck, since by default the game has a hint system that kicks in whenever it thinks you're taking too long in any given area. It's not super intrusive though, and it doesn't point you to an obvious solution unless you specifically ask for it. It can also be disabled or customized to trigger more frequently if you so desire. The enemy AI is also a step up from the average, with enemies always trying to flank you and come at you from different angles once you're spotted. However, you can still exploit stealth mechanics to reset and re-engage, so it's not really super groundbreaking. Then again, I didn't play on max difficulty because I'm not particularly good at survival shooters. Personally, I like the gameplay overall, so I don't really have a whole lot to add here. There aren't that many differences from the first game to begin with. If it's not broken, it doesn't need fixing. In terms of difficulty though, The Last of Us 2 provides the most difficulty options and assists I've ever seen in a video game. You can customize just about any aspect of the difficulty you want, from increasing your own health to decreasing how aggressive enemies are, or even the quantity of resources you find throughout the game. You can custom tailor everything to suit your personal playstyle.
Get off me!
The Last of Us Part 2 didn't hit me quite as hard as its predecessor. From a technical standpoint, it's solid, it has impressive visuals, animations, sounds, great performances from the actors, it does everything right. From a gameplay standpoint, it's also very good. Taking out enemies, upgrading your character and weapons, exploring the post-apocalyptic world, and scavenging for resources feels great. But its biggest flaw, in my opinion, is the story, which, like I said, several sections got me invested in caring about what was happening on screen, but others just had me questioning why the hell would this character do this? I also felt like certain portions of the game were just there to increase playtime, but that could also be because I just wasn't enjoying that part of the story as much, since story is such an integral part of The Last of Us. At the end of the day, would I recommend the game? I honestly don't know. I believe it will be a very divisive title, and I think the team at Naughty Dog is aware of this. Some fans will love it, other fans will hate it, and some, like me, will land somewhere in the middle. I'm still glad I played it because I enjoyed the gameplay and I wanted to see more of these characters, but I wish certain sections of the story were more believable. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to hit that like button. If you did not enjoy it, hit the dislike button because feedback is important. Feedback which you can also leave in the comment section down below. If you usually enjoy my content, consider subscribing and turning the bell notification on. Thank you very much for watching. Stay strong, stay safe, and I'll see you in the next one.